calling to order this hearing of the Minnesota Senate Taxes Committee, Thursday, January 16th, 2025. We're going to say it's 9 a.m. and ask the clerk to note that we have a quorum. This morning, we're going to continue in receiving reports that are available online from the Department of Revenue in many instances, if they're from the Department of Revenue. So if you, I think that information is available to you. We're going to start with the Department of Revenue's report on gross operating revenue. And we'll welcome Commissioner Marquardt to our committee this morning, and John Klockseam, is that good enough? Who is the Director of Property Tax Division for the Department of Revenue. Gentlemen, welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Chair Weber. Great to be back here, and Happy New Year to all. So, members, I'm joined here by John Klockseam, who will go over the presentation, but I'd like to give some opening remarks if I could. The issue we're looking at today is one that has confronted tax committees for a number of years, and it is dealing with state assessment of certain properties, which is utilities, pipelines, and railroads for the most part. And usually the county assesses most properties, but with these type of kind of unique properties, it's the Department of Revenue who does that. And the way it usually works, and all of those who have been around here for a while, it's this. The Department of Revenue will put out a valuation, and then utilities, railroads, pipelines will get that valuation and then end up appealing it, and usually going to litigation. Then what happens is the valuation will be lowered, and then cities and counties begin to worry about that because they're now seeing a loss of tax base. And the next step is cities and counties then come to us as legislators back in the day and say we're concerned here, we're losing this revenue and so forth. And then what we typically do, and I was guilty as a legislator, is saying, why can't the Department of Revenue get this right? That's usually what happened. And so what I found out is that it's the process that really is the concern. We have a lot of excellent people doing a lot of excellent work, spending a lot of time going through these evaluations. But what is inherent in that valuation process, as you're going to see with the presentation, is it's just inherently very open to discretion and judgment, and it's very complex and complicated. And so, quite frankly, the current system is not working. And just go back to 2021, when the state sent about $30 million roughly out to, I think, counties mainly, counties and cities, when a valuation came way down that really impacted tax bases. So it was about $30 billion, and then that year, the legislature asked the Department of Revenue to do a study, a report on that, which was, I think, presented maybe last year or a couple of years ago. So what we're looking at, and it's not a bill, it's just an idea, is how can we come up with a system that is more consistent, more transparent, more predictable, not only for businesses, but for counties and cities, knowing what their tax base is going to be, and also the taxpayer. So the concept is something moving from a property tax valuation system to a gross operating revenue tax. And so that's what this is going to be about today. And we've held a couple rounds of just hearings with all the stakeholders, businesses, counties, taxpayers, and so forth. And we're really looking to now the legislature for ideas. And in your packet, you also have some ideas on how we could improve the current system with Rule 8100 and Rule 8106. So you also have that, but this is a new idea. So with that, members, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to John Klockseam and his staff to go over the report. But thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome to the committee. If you'd identify yourself for the record.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is John Klockseam. I'm the Property Tax Director for the department. And I want to say thank you to the Commissioner for that opening. If you look at our, I want to start with our mission and vision today. If you look at that, working together to fund the future for all of Minnesota, and everyone reports, pays, and receives the right amount, no more, no less. Certainly, if the department has an idea, there's two words I want to point out in this mission statement: together. Together is the first one. If we have an idea, we don't want that solely to be the department's idea. We want to work together with the legislature, with all the stakeholders, and make sure that this is something that works for everybody. And then the right amount. So when I talk about the right amount, if we have contested situations all the time, then the right amount gets called into question for us. And we want to make sure that we have the right amount that drives the work that we do. And so that's why the mission and vision is there on that slide. Today, I'm going to talk about the current state of utility, railroad, and pipeline property. I'm going to cover a little bit of the current state of the appeals process, as the Commissioner mentioned, and litigation. We'll talk about legislation that we had in 2021, and then finally get to our idea we have around this tax called the gross operating revenues tax. So anytime you create a tax, you should have principles or benchmarks that that tax should fit into. Certainly, these benchmarks that we have already are in statute under 270C, I think it's 9901, where these are the benchmarks for property tax. And I think while they might be good for all sorts of taxes, for property tax, this is very appropriate. We want it to be transparent and simple, understandable as much as possible. We want it to be low cost and efficient, and treat all taxpayers kind of the same, right? And then finally, we need this stability and predictability within the tax system that allows people who receive the funding to rely on it, and the taxpayers who pay it to know what their burden is going to be. So that's very important for us, and I think it's just generally important overall. The state provides the valuations for utility and pipeline property, and the reason for that is that these entities own property, not just in one county, many times not just in one state or even a country. And so to put that burden on 87 different counties doesn't seem appropriate when it has to be looked at as a whole. And so that's what we're doing. We're valuing these properties as a whole, and the state does that on behalf of the counties. We do that under the rule 8106 for railroad property and 8100 for utility and pipeline property. And the rule has been shown to be robust and vigorous, but it also is complex. And when you have complexity, especially when you have discretion, that's where you can get into disagreements. And we do get into disagreements on the rule. So, yeah. A little high overview, and this is very high because I'm not an expert in this. I've got people in the division who are extreme experts. But I'm going to run through the process a little bit for you so you have a general understanding of how the process goes and what the steps are involved in producing a valuation. We start by valuing the entire company as a whole. That's the system unit value. And then we allocate a portion of that value that we come up with to Minnesota. Once we do that, we remove the locally assessed. If there's a property that's non-operating for that company, we take that out as locally assessed, and non-taxable property that we might have. We get down then to a Minnesota apportionable value. Once we have that apportionment, we parcel that out by parcel. And as you would expect, these taxpayers have a lot of parcels. So it's important to make sure that the data and the characteristics around that is correct. And then we provide equalization once we do that. Equalization makes sure that this type of property is not taxed any more than any other commercial industrial property. So for example, through our ratio studies, if the average ratio of commercial industrial property within jurisdiction is 85%, it doesn't make sense to value this at 100%. We equalize that down to 85% also. And then we certify those values to the counties, and then they calculate and apply a tax to it and send the bill out. So within that very first item that I talked about, the system unit value, within the rule, there is a lot of discretion. And I think that's kind of within the current system where we spend a bulk of our time talking and handling disagreements. The income level certainly is a thing that we talk about that's discretionary. The capitalization rate that gets applied to the income level to achieve a valuation in the income model has all sorts of inputs that can be debated and looked at, including the cost of debt, the cost of equity, and the overall capital structure. If you're familiar with the appraisal world, you know, it's not unusual to run several models of valuation, including a sales comparison, income, and a cost model. Within the rule focuses primarily on the cost and income models, and then a typical appraiser will, at the end, reconcile those two values. There's a little bit different process here where it's actually a weighting between the two values that the cost and income model produce. So there's disagreements on what is the proper weighting. Statute dictates 50-50 to start out with, but we can end up in a myriad of places for that weighting, and that certainly is something that we spend a lot of time talking about. And then finally, the commissioner has broad discretion to adjust the values as they see fit to whatever might be the market value. So when I talk about this and I talk about discretion, it's very important to note that I'm not talking about small amounts here. I'm talking about pretty large amounts. So when you look at the tax and the figure that you see on the screen is the actual tax, not the market value. But the tax over the years between 2008 to 24, these companies paid $6.4 billion in property tax, a huge support to the local jurisdictions. And it's not cheap for us either to complete these valuations. It takes us about $250,000 every year to produce these valuations, and that is both in the actual valuations themselves and then producing the cap rate study that we do that is a 300-page document that's very robust. Now, when I talk about that tax, we issue a valuation to each company, and obviously that's an order of the commissioner, and they have the right to appeal it. So in total, we've got about 122 companies, but every year what we see is a smaller percentage of those actual companies appealing. Only about a third, 29% to be exact, appeal their value, but the value that it's contained in those 29% is 88% of the overall value that we produce. And so almost 90% of the value that the department arrives at through the rule is under contention every year. And I think when you look at other tax types, this is vastly out of the norm. If somebody is under audit, you may have people contest that through an appeal here on probably 5 to 8% of those cases. So 88% and 5%. And I think that might be some of the reason that we're before you here today. There's a give and take when we go into administrative appeal. Certainly, the state knows that once these go into court, it becomes very expensive. And we have a desire to avoid court as much as possible. So through the administrative appeal process, we many times, with many companies, will reach a settlement or determination that while all sides might not be happy, they can live with. And I think this chart here that you have before you shows how that process is going. Where the blue bar is the department's initial valuation. The green bar is the companies saying, we think this is what the property is worth. And then the gray is kind of where we settle. So while this seems rather consistent and uniform, I think as values grow, the overall difference between the blue and the green, or the blue and the gray, continues to grow also. And that's an important note. Moving on to litigation, from the years 2008 to 2024, we've had 117 tax court cases, and the results are before you there. So if we achieve a settlement, we do slightly better, it seems, than if we actually go into court, where the actual reduction through settlement is 12% and change, and the tax court decision is about 15% reduction to the overall value. I think the totals here for reduction that we've seen, while the percentage of overall value that we've produced or tax that the companies have paid seems rather small, 106 million is still a large amount, and as much as possible, you know, I'm going back to my mission and vision, I want to have the right amount, and that just drives what I do. And so while 106 million in certain situations doesn't seem like a lot when you consider the total property tax paid throughout the state, but we do know that there can be acute cases, and the commissioner mentioned an acute case where the state actually had to step in and help out. Moving on to legislation, in 2021, we did have legislation that mandated that we review the rule, and we did so. We produced 2 reports as a result of that. One of those was looking at the rule itself and actually comparing that to all 50 states as much as we could get data on how they performed their utility valuations. And then we also produced a report engaging with stakeholders and putting out what we heard and what we found as a result of that process. I'm going to move on to our idea. That's a QR code for anybody who wants to scan that and go directly to where our materials may be. And so when we produced this idea, obviously we wanted to have those benchmarks and principles that I talked about earlier in mind. And we wanted to create something that was simple, easy to understand, provided predictability and stability to local governments, businesses, and taxpayers, and removed the discretionary factors from the market valuation process that we currently have. That was our goal. Here it is. Here's my idea. It's really quite simple. It's the gross operating revenues times an allocation factor times a rate, which the department would ask the legislature to decide on, equals a tax. You really have 3 variables in here. They would be or could be very well known, and I think you would have very few arguments around this. Now, we're always going to have discussion about appropriateness and level, but very few inputs to this idea. A little bit more about what those are. The gross operating revenues are the revenues generated from the operations of the company before deductions, expenses, taxes, depreciation, capital expenditures, and dividend payments. The allocation factor is a portion of the gross operating revenues assigned to Minnesota. And then the rate applies to the allocated gross operating revenues to determine the tax. This slide here shows the steps involved and the inputs for each one of these. Over on, well, at least for me, it's my left, is the current system. And then over on the right is the idea. And I think if you notice, I'm going to go here to the next slide. Those items that are in either salmon or pink color, those items are discretionary. And so you can see the areas where the department and the taxpayers may engage in discussions around what is the appropriate input to put into that. Within the new idea, as simple as it is with the inputs that we've got there really aren't any discretionary items. So while, I would like to believe that we have something new and novel here, that's not actually the case. We do have a similar tax like this in several other areas in the department, including the occupation tax, the minerals tax, and the gross proceeds tax. So within those function in a way that typically we do not see many appeals with those taxes. As the commissioner said, we've engaged on this idea, and in February, we published the idea itself, and then collected feedback and issued responses to the feedback that we received. We published a list of questions along with the department's responses to those questions, and then we continued on producing a summary, and then we published a current system summary as well. We published summary information, which shows if the tax was neutral, what that would look like approximately for jurisdictions. And then we did that for a current year and then also for a number of years going back. And those documents, as you can see here, are out on the website and anybody can take a look at those. We did have stakeholder reaction with this idea, as you would expect. And it ran the gamut, obviously. There's a good, healthy level of scrutiny and criticism, and I think that's good. And should we decide, or should you decide to move forward, we would want to handle all that criticism and answer those questions. Some of them, for example, are on the screen here. Could companies falsely report their revenues? The way it's set up with the gross operating revenues, the department doesn't believe so. Some said, well, why don't we just keep the current system and create a lag year? That is a possibility that handles reporting and allows the department to get through the administrative appeal process, but it doesn't do anything to handle discretion. So we're going to further analyze this and look at it. And we've heard things like we want a transition aid. Should there be impacts that are particularly large in our community? Some stakeholders said the taxes are already too high. And some people said we just like the simplicity of this idea. It's easy to understand, and the current system is complex and hard to understand. So what do I intend to do next? I intend to listen, and I intend to communicate. I don't know if I can do much more than that, but that is my goal, is to listen and communicate. So with that, I'll stand for any questions that you might have.
Commissioner Marquardt first.
So, well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I think I made a rookie mistake by not introducing myself early on for the record. I'm Paul Marquardt, the Commissioner of Revenue. I think I forgot to do that right from the start. So, thank you, John, for the presentation. And Again, I just think this is something to look at and how we can make the tax code more transparent, more predictable. And this may not be the solution, but we're just kind of reaching out. We're in this stage. We really want input and also would invite members that if you'd like to meet individually or in groups or whatever to go over this further, we would love to do that. So thank you so much for allowing us to make this presentation.
Thank you, Commissioner. We have questions. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, thank you also for the report. I totally agree that what we have is not working, and definitely it needs, we need to look at this. I just have to get a more, as you'd say, transparent, less adjudicated rates. But what I want to know is on determining the gross operating revenues, I just have a couple questions regarding it's before deductions. And I wonder about that, if, because it's before deductions, how would that impact, I mean, I'm just thinking about our utilities needing to do safety upgrades, rail upgrades, efficiency upgrades that benefit taxpayers. And I'm wondering if the fact that this gross operating revenues before deductions, how that would impact incenting our utilities or prohibiting them from making those necessary upgrades.
Mr. Clarkson, I don't pronounce your name correctly, I'm sorry.
You're doing just fine, Madam Chair. Madam Chair and Senator Nelson. So a number of things have been looked at regarding that first input, including gross revenues. Also, cash flow has been mentioned. Net operating income has been mentioned. And I guess my response to that would be, should some of these things be concerning to calculating the tax, it would be a possibility to modify that first input and say, we're going to look at this and only this, or we're going to look at this and take out these specific things for it. But I know that revenues is just one input, and companies run their businesses either over a period of years or long-term according to a management style that may have more capital inputs that they decide to do. And these are management decisions that are after gross revenues. I recognize that.
Thank you.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kloxim, and also Commissioner Markwart. Thanks for your leadership. The department's been horrible at this in the past, and I think it's very positive for Minnesota that we have government actually saying, you know what, we don't do this real well. We need to find a different approach. And again, just thank you for your leadership on that. That's I don't see that often in Minnesota government, but Commissioner, good job. And Mr. Kloxim, first of all, the revenue portion of this and the reporting of it to the department in order for it to work, I assume there's going to have to be, using from a different slide, you had the word lag, so you're going to have to look back a year or two probably from the current year. And I'm guessing you're going to be, so if you're talking about property taxes for 2025, you're going to be looking at like 2023 revenue or something? How close or far apart are those going to be?
Mr. Kloxim.
Madam Chair and Senator Drazkowski. So yes, I think right now within the current system, there is some tension with how we produce the valuation. And I think the tension many times does center around that reporting. So companies will finish up their year end, their books, and then we're saying, we need you to get this information sometime in March or early April in order for us to continue on our way and produce the valuation. We've heard feedback from companies that this timeline is very tight for them, and sometimes they might submit information and then amend information. And so we could keep that current way of operating, or we could build in a lag that would say, We know that this is a tax, but this is a tax that is lagged based off of your performance in '23 that you're going to now pay in '25. And that's a little bit out of norm for the property tax system. We have a sales study, we assess the value, and then the next year you pay the tax. But we're kind of taking this out of the property tax system. We're using it to fund local governments, still the same, but it would kind of come out. So doing a comparison between the two to say that they have to match is maybe unnecessary.
Senator, did you want to continue?
Yes.
Yes, Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kloxing. So, yeah, I think if you had some sort of leg there, it would give you even more of that simplicity and predictability and accuracy and less, less litigation, less other stuff as we think about this. The communities that depend on this tax revenue for them to operate, characterize again, and maybe I wasn't listening real well, what your discussion's been with them so far. Have you had individual meetings with the communities that depend largely on this? And what do you plan for the future in that regard?
Mr. Kloxing.
Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Kloxing.
Senator, yes, obviously those communities that have a large portion of their tax capacity, many times in a generating plant, are very concerned about any change that may impact their funding. That's completely understandable. So I think we have to work that into the discussion as we talk about this. And with our summary information, we tried to say, what would this look like for your community if throughout the state for utilities, pipelines, and railroads, essentially they paid the same tax as they did today. So kind of using an approximate rate that was tax neutral. And they took a look at that, and they were very hesitant to say, I can't even give you an opinion on this until I know approximately what this may do. And when we did produce the summary information, then they were like, I still have concerns that I'm gonna lose tax dollars, obviously. But now that you've given me summary information, I can at least see what this may do. And I appreciate that this idea is simple and predictable and relatively stable.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kloxing.
Thank you. Senator Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was thinking about our local governments too, and certainly in many instances, for example, thinking back to the case of 21, which we needed to provide funding for the refunds that were given. The commercial classification of a pipeline property varies from county to county as to what portion of their overall tax base it is. And so I am assuming that when you, through this gross income idea, as far as distribution to the counties, you're looking at a simple allocation of the company's pipeline in Minnesota divided by the miles it covers, and how are you making the allocation to the individual counties if you're standardizing the rate?
Mr. Kloxing.
Madam Chair and Senator Weber, we would kind of keep an old piece of the valuation system the way it is now, where we look at the original cost and try to allocate out to the particular parcels by the original cost that the companies reported was necessary to put that property in place for the locations where they have property. And that is currently how we assign the valuation, and we would kind of keep that to a certain respect to also assign the tax.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Commissioner, Mr. Kloxing, have you looked at other approaches to the way to taxing these three types of properties. Why and how did you come to, other than just saying, well, it's simpler, which has a lot of appeal, why did you come to this particular approach? And how do other states tax this property? Do they do it through a property tax calculation? Do they do it through gross revenues? Do they use other measures? And how did you kind of settle on this one as an avenue to pursue?
Madam Chair, I'm not completely the expert, so I would have to call on staff or get back to you on that question about how other states do it. It's my understanding that to a large degree, they have some semblance of the components that we have in Minnesota, although they're not all the same in how they do it. Some of them may remove certain items of discretion that we currently do have. And so, for example, they may say, we're going to use a capitalization rate of 6%, and we won't deviate from that. That's what we're going to use. And then that becomes simpler for that state to administer in that regard. So I know that when we did do our analysis in 2021 of the other states, that analysis is in there, and you can look at what each state does with regard to how they tax these. So there isn't really what I'll say. This is an idea, and there really isn't a silver bullet. I'll say.
I was thinking that.
But one idea, this seemed like a good idea for us to use and what we're willing to promote.
Thank you. And
Commissioner?
Madam Chair, the only thing I would add is that in the report, I believe we had examples of what other states
Okay,
were doing
we'll
there. that
look at
could
those. Thank you.
Looked at that. If that, they're giving me the nod. I thought I remembered seeing that.
Yeah, thank you. Senator House-Child.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Klockseam, I appreciate the presentation. And I had similar questions to Senator Weber, and I think you kind of said this, but I want to just kind of put it on a finer point. When you say revenue neutral, you're talking for the company, I believe, and it's possible that certain counties or communities could see some fluctuations maybe in the near term, but we might have to subsidize them in a sense to make up for some of those revenues for those local communities. And then I do have a follow-up, Madam Chair.
Mr. Klockseam.
Madam Chair, Senator, yes, to a certain degree. What we did is we approximated the tax for all companies within Minnesota by what I'll call property type, whether it's gas transmission, electric utility, pipeline, and railroad, and so forth. And we said, let's look at the total tax that these companies pay. And then let's assume that when we would make a switch, that total tax would magically be the same. Now, there'll be a rate needed to be decided on if you want to do that, to get there. But if the tax is the same, let's put it into the system and see how it shakes out. And you're exactly correct. There were nuances within each taxing jurisdiction that we saw, but I think most of those nuances that we saw were small. Most of them were small. Now, in cases where they were a little bit larger, I think that would be a question for the legislature to say, how do we want to treat this? How do we want to mitigate this for the time period that it exists?
Thanks so much. And then on that point further.
Senator House-Child.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. On that point further, I saw fiscal disparities, and that makes my ears perk. And I'm just curious, when you're thinking about those counties that might be more impacted, do you anticipate that regions that have fiscal disparities, like the Iron Range, could be additionally impacted due to the complexity of those formulas, or is it the same?
Mr. Klockseam.
Madam Chair, Senator, this was brought up during our listening sessions, and I have to be honest, until that was brought up, I hadn't really thought about it, right? And so not to propose a solution right off the top of my head, but I think, if fiscal disparities is really designed to kind of share that tax base, and if you have a good growth in your commercial industrial, you share a little bit more, right? That's just the way it's kind of set up. So we could model that based off of, maybe growth in gross revenues, kind of within that county for those particular properties that are state assessed. And maybe the growth in growth revenues kind of somewhat equates to the growth in CI, and that sharing could still occur in that regard.
Anyone else? Thank you very much, gentlemen. I think, at some point it might be instructive to the committee to invite representatives from these three interests with regard to their proposal, and just hear directly from them at another hearing about their thoughts, their reactions, their praise, their skepticism, so that we appreciate that you're acknowledging them, and this is a work in process, but might be really helpful for the whole group here to hear directly from them, and perhaps Mr. Kloxim, with you present, not testifying necessarily, but just present to listen to what they want to say to us, hopefully in moving forward in the next year. Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you,
gentlemen.
Madam Chair, members.
And next, we have another, these are all reports today from various folks in the Department of Revenue. There's been a lot of interest in the Board of Assessors report, and so we invite Kelly, is it Isti? Is that correct, or?
Yitzty, yes.
Isti.
Madam Chair.
Assistant Director of the Property Tax Division. We welcome you to the committee and your report, if you would identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. For the record, my name is Kelly Yitzty, and I'm here today to present the Minnesota State Board of Assessors report for the fiscal years 23 to 24. As you said, I am a former member of the Minnesota State Board of Assessors, and I served on the board as the executive secretary when this report was compiled. And I'm also the assistant director for property taxes at the Department of Revenue. I do not have a slideshow today. I'll just be walking through the report, which you should have received a copy. This report is required under Minnesota Statutes 21407. Along with the requirements under that statute, it also includes information on disciplinary actions as required under 270.41 subdivision 3A. The Minnesota State Board of Assessors regulates assessors under statutes 270.41 through 270.5. Assessors are responsible for determining market values and classifications of properties in their jurisdictions. Market values determined by the assessors are the starting point for calculating property taxes every year. And there's various other factors that affect the actual tax amounts. The board sets and enforces rules and standards that covers assessors' education, work experience, and job performances. The board is appointed by the Commissioner of Revenue, and by statute, the board's 9 members must include 2 Department of Revenue members, 2 county assessors, 2 assessors who are not county assessors, 1 private sector property appraiser, and 2 public members. There are 4 main functions that the State Board of Assessors performs. They grant and renew assessor licenses. They established criteria for determining assessor qualifications between the different levels of licenses. And they review, establish, and coordinate education courses on assessment practices. And they also handle complaints against assessors and takes action where appropriate. So on page 2 of the report, reviews the rule changes. In 2024, there were 7 changes to Minnesota Rules 1950, which govern assessor licensure, education, and conduct. They include a definition change, several updates to reflect consistency with the statutory requirements under 270C.9901. The rule changes also included clarifying language for temporary license holders available to members of the military, and as well as certified general appraisers seeking temporary certified Minnesota assessor licenses. These changes took effect for the licensing cycle that began July 1st, 2024, and that is a 4-year licensing cycle. Page 3 of the report lists the members of the board and employees during the time of the report covers. Page 4 includes a table of board funds. As you will note, the board collects various fees for licenses and exam gradings that are required under the statute 270.44. These monies are used to perform the duties of the board activities. In fiscal years 23 and 24, the board's total expenses were $218,651, and the income was $202,380,000. Pages 4 through 5 of the report give a breakdown of the number of licensed assessors as of June 30th, 2024. In total, there were 902 active licensed assessors at that date. This included 312 senior accredited Minnesota assessors, which is the highest license for an assessor in our state. There were 249 accredited Minnesota assessors, 2 certified Minnesota assessor specialists, 215 certified Minnesota assessors, 3 temporary license holders, and 121 trainees. And just a note, to achieve the senior accredited Minnesota assessor license, the candidate must pass an oral interview in front of the board. During fiscal years 23 and 24, there were 47 assessors who sat for an oral exam with the board, and 44 passed. Pages 6 through 7 also include tables with summaries on new license applications on each license level, and they are subdivided by age and state of residency. Finally, on page 6, it's noted that there was 1 complaint received by the board during this report period of an alleged violation of professional ethics and standards, and at this time of the report, the complaint was still pending board action. That concludes the presentation for the Minnesota State Board of Assessors biennial report, and with that, I'll stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm just busy looking at all these variations in how much each individual participates on the board. But are there questions or comments about this report? So you have to do this every 2 years, is that right?
That's correct.
And why?
Chair Rest, Minnesota statutes 270.41 govern the biennial reports required. This is a, I believe it's called non-healthcare board. And the legislature amended our 270, our statutes, 270.41 subdivision 3A, to combine the two reports that we were providing, which was the one that's required for all boards, along with the one that's specific to the Board of Assessors, into one report. So this is actually the second biennial report that we've issued
I
as
see.
their.
So it's a fairly new new report within the last 5 or 6 years, is that right?
Correct, the combination is, yes.
Has the Board of Assessors ever been the subject of a review by the Legislative Auditor's Office?
Madam Chair, not to my knowledge, but I can, go back into the records to see if I can find.
I assure you, if it had been, you would know. Okay. So, well, thank you very much, and we appreciate the work you folks do, and we know it's separate from what the county assessors are doing, and we appreciate your work.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members.
Thank you. Before we go to the next report, I had neglected to put on the agenda approval of yesterday's minutes. I'm going to ask members to review the minutes right now, just quickly, and I ask if there are any corrections or additions. Seeing none, the minutes stand approved as presented. Next, we have Mr. Klockseam coming back on the Department of Revenue's review of the 2024 Lakeshore Valuation report, which is also in your packets. Mr. Klockseam, welcome back to the committee, and once again, if you would identify yourself for the record.
Madam Chair, for the record, my name is John Klockseam. I'm the Property Tax Director at the Department of Revenue. My intention today is not to go through the report line by line. It's a pretty short report, and so I just want to point out some major points and kind of, if you have questions about that, go from there. But in 2023, the legislature directed us to produce a report on the assessment methods used to value acreage and shoreline areas within all commissioner, and when I say commissioner, I mean DNR, administered and county administered other natural resources land. I think after me, you're going to have somebody talk about a PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. That's payments that the state makes on two local jurisdictions for land that the state holds. But this was dictated to us in 2023, and those two types of lands are two of the three major categories, the other category being the acquired natural resources lands and wildlife areas. So those two areas that we were supposed to report how the assessor determines the value on shoreline acres and non-shoreline acres. So those areas currently are paid at $3 an acre, and that was changed in 2023. Previously, it was $2 an acre. So while the report focuses on the methods that the assessors used, I want to talk first about exempt property and when assessors assess those. So they do those on a 6-year basis. And so the last year that the assessors valued the properties for their exempt assessment was in 2022, and they'll do so again in 2028. We allow the assessors to report the value if it changes in their systems because they're getting used to valuing these in their computer-assisted mass appraisal systems just like everything else. And they can report that new value to us, but the value from 2022 is the value that's effective until 2028. I just want to point that out. So overwhelmingly, the counties indicated to us that they are using the sales comparison approach to value for these lands. That makes sense to me. I would think that according to the highest and best use, which is probably residential within these areas, that they would use the sales comparison approach as the data that they have and the most appropriate method to value these properties. For those Lakeshore properties, they primarily used an element of comparison of a price per front foot or a combination of a site value with front foot. And so that's how they did that. I want to make a note about the results. Because we were just mandated to say, how are they valuing these? The results themselves are just, we should be very careful looking at these results because we did not get into whether a particular value on a parcel was appropriate or was not appropriate. So I should state that. So for example, within the Lakeshore portion of the report, a parcel could be reported to us by a county that had 100 feet of shoreline, but the total parcel size was 3 acres. We could also have another parcel that was reported to us as having Lakeshore on it with 100 feet of shoreline once again, but be 70 acres. And so that, if you will, noise within the data exists, and we just have to acknowledge that it is there. I think when you look in Appendix B and the totals that we've got approximately 9.64 times as many acres that are commissioner-administered and county-administered land, natural resources land that are not Lakeshore as we do with acres that are reported as Lakeshore. But within the value of non-Lakeshore areas that are commissioner-administered and county-administered, it's only 3.94 times the value, even though the acres are vastly larger. So I think my main takeaway for you there is when the assessors are valuing these for their exempt assessment, it seems to indicate that they are taking into account the presence of Lakeshore on these parcels and making a value adjustment appropriately. And with that, I'll stand for any questions that you might have.
Any questions on this report? Senator Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of years ago, when I chaired the Property Tax Subcommittee, one of the issues that I became aware of regarding Lakeshore properties really deals with our resorts in the state of Minnesota. Now, you indicated there that the land value is basically appraised as and valued as residential development land. And I understand, obviously, the concept of the cost approach, which you go in and you value the land as unimproved and go on from there. However, in many instances, as it relates to our resorts, with the nature of the improvements, et cetera, residential development may or may not be the highest and best use of that land. So what provisions are allowed for in the valuation process to take that into consideration? Mr. Klotzing.
Mr. Klotzing.
Madam Chair, Senator Weber, the licensed assessors within Minnesota will use all available data that they have to them to arrive at a value. And they should be starting, as you know, within the appraisal process with the highest and best use analysis. And so should they arrive that, all the 4 tests legally permissible and so forth, but they should do a test as vacant and a test as improved, right? And if that test as improved shows that the highest and best use is as resort property, then I think that's the way they have to proceed with their valuation.
Senator Weber.
And I think that would be correct, Mr. Klotzing, except I think that what we have seen happen in the resort industry is that with a substantial increase in valuations and thus their real estate tax, many of them have succumbed to the business pressures caused by that and have wound up, quite frankly, saying, okay, if this is what they're going to tax me at, I'm just going to cease operations and sell it off to a developer. And thus, we've seen the number of family-owned resorts decline considerably in the state of Minnesota. which I find problematic. I come from the southwest corner of the state, and I only need, I think, one hand to count the number of campground resorts or resorts in my district, but up in the north part of the state, that becomes an issue. And unfortunately, I think what we're winding up doing is denying our families the opportunity of finding a family-run resort that they can go to and afford these days. Actually, at that time, I even questioned maybe the need for a Blue Acres law, which would resemble the Green Acres law that prohibits us from assigning development value to a business or to farmland, for example, that's continuing to be farmed. And I'm not sure, to be honest with you, as I visit with the industry, as I visit with people in the business, that maybe enough consideration is given to the issue of highest and best use. And if the land has got a higher value because of its development potential, then quite frankly, the improvement should be diminished in value because they're a non-conforming use at that point in time. And so I think we need to discuss that particular classification, quite frankly, and what is happening to an important element of industry in our state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Kloxim, any response?
Yeah, Madam Chair and Senator Weber, I think, you know, this topic, as you say, has been around for a number of years, and you know that we currently have two classifications for resorts. You know, we have what we used to call Ma and Pa resorts, the 1C classification, and then also the commercial resort classification. And within those, they received a particular rate that was somewhat preferential, but I'm not entirely convinced that the classification rate as it exists and the requirements within statute that they need to meet currently to attain that classification fit very well with how resorts are run and operated today. And so it might be something to look at in the future.
Senator Hellstrom.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate it again, Mr. Kloxim, for the presentation. So under the PILT portion of this, I just want to read this. The purpose is compensate local units of government for the loss of tax base for state ownership of land and the need to provide services for state land. So from my understanding, this report, my hope was that we would get to the point of showing that Lakeshore property is more valuable than non-Lakeshore property. Is that your understanding of what this report would hopefully do?
Mr. Kloxim.
Madam Chair, Senator, again, I caution looking at the results because the mandate that we received was what are the methods that they're using to value it? And again, you know, we kind of, you know, did not comment on whether those values were appropriate or not. You know, certainly our guidance to assessors when they do any sort of valuation is market value, right? So don't apply any sort of standard of market value unless statute dictates it to the properties that you're appraising, even if they are exempt properties. And so while many of these lands are held by the state, we have within statute, they should be valuing them according to a fee simple analysis, right? With the understanding that there is variations in lakeshore terrain,
Right.
water depth, access, utilities, and all those things that make up valuation when they do that analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kloxim. We'll go on to the final report then, which is Department of Revenue shared with the Department of Natural Resources on PILT. So I welcome is Bob Meyer here? Anyway, we'll just begin with your introductions of yourselves, and then members have the report with the pretty bluebird on the front there instead of a turtle. We got turtles yesterday. Today we get bluebirds. Very beautiful bluebirds. So who is going to begin, and if you'd identify yourself, please.
We'll begin in a moment. We're just going to.
Sure, take it however long you like. It's working. It's good.
Go ahead. Do you want to? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Kelly Yitzty. I'm the Assistant Director of Property Taxes at the Department of Revenue.
And good morning, everyone. Madam Chair, Chair Weber. My name is Kirsten Larson. I'm the Strategic Land Asset Management, or SLAM Supervisor within the Division of Lands and Minerals at the Department of Natural Resources. And today we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the PILT program and kind of the current status of where we are at.
Thank you.
We'll talk
ahead.
about three topics. First, just some basics. Then we'll go through an overview of the current PILT system, and then Kelly will speak to PILT calculation and distribution. So first, just to provide a little bit of introductory context, and this has already been spoken to a bit, what is PILT? So payment in lieu of taxes is a form of local government aid paid for tax-exempt natural resources land, and the purposes of PILT are really threefold. So the first, as we mentioned during the last presentation, is to compensate local units of government for the loss of tax base from state ownership of land and the continuing need to provide services for those lands. The second piece is really to address the disproportionate impact of state land ownership on local units of government in places that have a large proportion of state land, and to address the need to manage state lands held in trust for local taxing districts or tax forfeited lands. Taken collectively, the state owns about 10 to 11% of, or 5.6 million acres of the 55.6 million acres within the state's borders. But of course, where you are in the state really makes a difference. You can see that the farther north and east you go on this map, the deeper the color gets, and that really explains the higher the percentage of lands that are in state ownership. Then just a really high overview of kind of the history
Go
of
back
annual.
just a
Sure.
moment to the map.
Yes.
And I'm trying to imagine the, which senators represent the area on the map that is the darkest color. I mean, where does PILT really have come to the forefront as a focus of the interests of those legislators? And I'm assuming, Senator Housechild, that on this, can you point out kind of like where your district is? And then if anybody else knows who's the rest
Yeah,
of
I-
them, Senator Weber, maybe you can help us? Just
Madam
interest-
Chair, I can answer your question.
Okay, or
Yep.
for everybody, if you would then.
So
I mean,
my,
and if you'd look at the map, that would help us
right,
draw lines.
yeah. So my district are the three counties on the tip of the arrowhead there, and then that northern really dark county is Kuchaching.
So is that the 36.45 and then the two next to it?
I know you asked me to look at the map. I
Yeah,
was
you
looking at the
need to
screen.
look at the packet in there. It's hard to read on the screen.
Okay, so my district is the 69.47, the 36.45, 24.92, and the 15.42.
Okay,
Senator Rarick's is 52.72, 27.53, and I believe 25.92. And then Senator, I believe, either Green or Johnson, and Senator Weber, you could fill in, but I think he's in the Lake of the Woods 58.41.
That would be Senator Green's.
That'd be Senator Green's, yeah. And he'd also be, I believe, 44.65. Yep,
So it's,
Senator Utke would be south of that.
yep.
okay, so it's Utke, Green, Housechild, Wearick,
And Farnsworth.
And
Was the
Farnsworth.
last one that I was
Okay.
gonna mention, yep.
And
And Icorn, I suppose, if you wanna
And-
count the
and-
34.27.
Just, I think it's important to keep in mind when we hear from them, or when this topic comes up, why we hear particularly from these 6 senators, rather than those of us that represent Hennepin County, for example, so, or Laverne,
Well,
for that
may
matter.
I make a comment?
Of course, go right ahead. Senator Weber.
What we are starting to see happen is with the sales tax amendment that's out there, which provides additional money for the purchase of that kind of land, what we see happening are groups, nonprofit groups buying property and then reselling to the DNR, who uses that money to expand the state holdings. And then it becomes PILT land. Now, when that happens on tillable land, which goes then from a taxable rate as agricultural land down to a PILT acreage, even though our acres may be substantially less, it's starting to have a profound impact on county tax revenues. And I am actually debating about submitting a bill that takes it out of PILT and forces the state to pay the market rate of what the land was when it went in, because eventually they're going to pay the bill anyway.
I don't know if that's a threat or a promise.
It's a reality,
There's a reality.
yeah.
Okay.
You know, there'll be a request for county program aid, Madam Chair, or LGA, or what have you.
Okay, we just wanted to get the lay of the land here, if you will.
Madam Chair, Chair Weber, that makes sense.
Sure. Okay, you can, please continue then.
Just a high-level overview of annual PILT payments over time. You can see that since 1981, they've kind of stair-stepped up through time, and Kelly will speak a little bit more to why you see those kind of 6-year jumps. Then in 2024, the most recent PILT year, paid fiscal year 2025, the state made $48.1 million in payments for 8.5 million acres of state-owned and state-leased land. And this does reflect an increase from the 2023 payment of $39.8 million. Every year, the state makes PILT payments on July 20th. So just to give you a very, again, high-level overview of lands that are eligible for PILT. So as we've discussed, all lands that are held by the state in fee title and administered by the DNR are eligible for PILT
And would you
payments.
explain what fee title means, please?
That means that we own it outright. It's not an easement. We own the surface interest of the land. In addition, there are what we call LUP, or land utilization project lands, that are leased by the DNR from the federal government for conservation management purposes. We pay PILT on those lands. And in addition, there are transportation wetlands administered by MnDOT that receive PILT payments, and the area of the Camp Ripley Game Refuge that's administered by the Department of Military Affairs around Camp Ripley also receives PILT payments. And then one of the biggest buckets of eligibility is for tax forfeited land that's administered by the counties. All of Minnesota's PILT laws, or PILT eligibility, is defined in Minnesota Statute 477A. So in addition to land eligibility, within that eligibility, there are also several land classes. And the land class determines the PILT payment rate. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these payment land classes and the related payment rate. So the first land class I'll talk about are acquired natural resources lands. So those are about 1 million acres of state-owned land that are lands acquired from private owners to be managed by the DNR, with the exception of WMAs, which I will talk about in a minute. And it also includes something called consolidated conservation lands that are located within state parks, state rec areas, scientific and natural areas, and wildlife management areas. So those lands are paid at, and I'm still learning, so forgive me, but a little over $5 per acre, or 0.75% of the total value of the appraised land owned by the state in that county. So a county can select which payment rate they would like, depending on whichever is greater. In addition, similarly, we have something that's classed separately as wildlife management land. That's about 506 acres. And those are lands that were acquired from private owners that are managed by the DNR for wildlife management areas. So those two classes are really similar. There's just a delineation in statute. The other really large kind of category or bucket of PILT lands are called DNR-administered other natural resources lands. And those include all lands that were not on tax rolls when the DNR acquired them, so they weren't in private ownership. We typically acquired them from another government entity. This largely includes things like school trust lands or, again, consolidated conservation lands outside of those outdoor rec units I talked about earlier, as well as county-administered tax forfeited lands, and those lands are paid at $3 per acre. There are a few other much smaller classes of land that I'll briefly touch on. Again, those land utilization project or LUP lands. Those are paid at a little over $2.56. A little over $5.13 per acre. And then just briefly, we have a much smaller, two more classes of lands that are much smaller. Military refuge lands, those Camp Ripley lands, those are paid at a little over $2.56 an acre, and then a small amount of these transportation wetlands that are paid similarly to the acquired natural resources lands. So a little over $5.13 an acre, or 0.75% of the total appraised value of lands where they're located. Finally, just as an aside, Lake Vermilion Sudan Underground Mine State Park has its own PILT statute, and it's governed by MS 477A.17. So in laws
Why
of...
is that? Why, what were the considerations for making Lake Vermilion Sudan having a special consideration for PILT?
Madam Chair, I might have to go back to my team and just provide some context so that I don't have the answer to that today, but we'll get it for you.
Senator Nelson.
One question along that line. What is is there a PILT payment then for the Lake Vermilion Sudan underground mine, and what is that? What's that amount per acre?
At the end of your packet, you will
Ms.
find...
Hetze, you have to come through.
Oh, Madam Chair, my apologies. At the end of your packet, you will find kind of a table, a PILT payment at a glance, and you'll be able to find the Vermilion Sudan Underground State Park total payment for fiscal year 2025. That was $481,000.
Senator Nelson? That's okay, okay. Please continue.
Madam Chair, members, what I'd like to talk about next are some of the recent legislative changes that were enacted in the 2023 session. There were 3 or 4 categories of changes. I'd like to talk about the first set of changes related to the creation of supplemental payments for counties that meet certain eligibility criteria. So first, for counties whose PILT eligible acreage is 25% or more of their total county acreage, they will receive a supplemental payment of 18 cents an acre. During fiscal year 2025, or the last PILT payment period, 12 counties met this eligibility criteria, and an additional payment of about $1.2 million was made. That made up about 2.5% of the total PILT payment that was made for fiscal 2025. In addition, there was a second criteria that was identified for counties whose PILT acreage is between 10 and 25% of their total county acreage. They receive a supplemental payment of 8 cents an acre. 9 counties met this eligibility criteria, making up about $72,000 of the total PILT payment that was made, less than 0.5% of the total payment. The second set of changes that was referenced in an earlier discussion related to payment rates for tax forfeited lands and DNR administered other natural resources lands. So those are things, again, like school trust lands and con lands. Payment rates for these lands were increased from $2 to $3 during that 2023 session. Thank you. For tax forfeited lands, the total PILT payment went from about $5.6 million in calendar year 2023 to $8.3 million in calendar year 2024, which was fiscal year 2025, this past July 20th PILT payment. For DNR administered other natural resources lands, these school trust lands, con lands, et cetera, the total PILT payment went from about $8.2 million in calendar year 2023 to $12.3 million in calendar year 2024. Another change that we wanted to touch on was related to assessed value. So the appraised value of PILT natural resources lands moving forward won't be reduced below their assessed year 2022 or any appraised values that are subsequent that might be higher. We won't see the impact of this specific change until the 28-28 reappraisal year that Kelly will talk about in a moment. And that will be paid in calendar year 2029 or fiscal year 2030. So we'll stay tuned to see the impacts of that change. The final change to touch on was that the Department of Revenue was authorized to annually adjust the PILT payment amounts by a cost of living adjustment. Thank you. That was identified in statute. This upcoming fiscal year 2026, calendar year 2025, will be the first year that we see the impact of this legislative change. And staff from both the Department of Revenue and DNR are meeting actually this week to develop calculations and understand what that's going to look like. Very preliminary estimates suggest that that change will be kind of in the range of $630,000. I was told I could share that, but it may change a bit between now and when the payment is made this summer. With that, I will turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about the calculation and distribution of PILT.
Thank you.
Thank you. So PILT distribution, the
And
distribution.
if you would re-identify yourself for the record.
Yes, Madam Chair. Again, my name is Kelly Yitzty. I am Assistant Director of Property Taxes at the Department of Revenue. Thank you. PILT distribution or apportionment of the PILT payments. The instructions are published each year by the Department of Revenue. We publish them on our website. The apportionment of the PILT payments are outlined within 477A, and they direct counties how this money must be distributed to the taxing jurisdictions where the property is located. The PILT payments are made by the Department of Revenue on July 20th each year to the counties, and the counties must generally distribute this money to any township, city, school within 30 days. There's 3 different distribution systems under the law. One is for wildlife management and military refuge lands, one for the Lake Vermilion Sudan Underground Mine State Park, and then one for all other types of PILT. Annually, the Department of Natural Resources calculates the PILT using the land record systems and certifies it to the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue then reviews the certification, makes sure that there's no errors, and then makes the payments to the counties. The payments are countywide and not based on like a per parcel payment. So I'll talk about the 6-year reappraisal. Every 6 years, the county assessors are required to reappraise all acquired natural resource lands and wildlife management lands. The next estimated market value reappraisal will be in 2028. As previously mentioned, the reappraised market values can never fall below the 2022 appraised value or any other subsequent appraisal that values the land higher, so it won't go down.
Okay, are there questions about this report or additional information that members might need? Senator Halshaw.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Super granular question, but on the Lake Vermilion Sudan Park portion, if you guys could find out what that distribution is as well. I've heard questions from Brighting Township on lack of PILT payments from that. And it's very nuanced, like you said, so maybe I'll just follow up directly, but appreciate the presentation.
Yes, Madam Chair, Senator Hauschild, we can get that information to you, yeah.
Thank you. Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just wondering if maybe, if they could characterize kind of what those distribution systems are and how they work just quickly. And then why is the Sudan mine PILT payment at $117 an acre when the rest of them are at about $5?
Madam Chair.
Whichever one of you would like to answer that, please.
So I can speak a little to the distribution, and it is outlined in statute. I don't have the language in front of me or the granular level, but if it is supposed to go down, with the exception of townships at 10%, they're supposed to flow down to the taxing jurisdiction and where the property is located, and that's based on acreage. And then to your other question about the Lake Vermilion Sudan underground mine, I don't know why the legislature saw fit to give that amount, but we can look into, what was passed and why, if that's helpful.
Madam Chair, Senator Drazkowski, I can speak a bit to that, just in terms of the fact that the payment rate, instead of being based on a per acre dollar value, is set at 1.5% of the appraised value of the land within the park. And so I'm imagining that that must translate into the higher per acre rate, but I can't speak to the context within which that decision was made. We can follow up and provide some of that background.
Okay, thank you. Senator Barr.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The PILT payments, you said they're going to go to an automatic inflator. You're going to start inflating. How are you calculating, what are you using for inflation? I mean, you're not using CPI, I hope. Is it assessed land value in the same area? I mean, how are you figuring land values going up? How are you figuring inflation? What's your base?
Madam Chair, Senator, we may have to provide a little bit of additional guidance on exactly what statute directs us to do. It is defined in statute, and we will follow up to get you exactly what that information is.
Thank you very much. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one comment. I thought I understood you, one of you, to say that these automatic inflation-adjusted payments can never go down. That's a kind of a worrisome trend. Did I understand that correctly? So once there's a year of inflated values at maybe a high percent, it can never go down. Is that the meaning? Is that what you meant to say?
Please.
Madam Chair, Senator Nelson, yes, one of the law changes last year stated that the appraised value of these PILT lands can never go down. So the 2022 value was the last time these properties were valued. They're valued every 6 years by the county assessors. The next valuation where they need to re-look at the value is 2028. That number in 2020.
Excuse me, we don't allow private photography in this hearing room. Only the press and Senate photographers. Please, please respect our guidelines here. Thank you.
Madam Chair. So the next time those properties will be valued is 2028. And that the value in 2028 may not be below what the value was in 2022. If the value is higher in 2028, then that is the new bar. And the plain language of the statute says it cannot go below. It can't go down, yes.
Well,
Senator Nelson.
Madam Chair, I just want to register that I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem, that the taxpayers are automatically necessitated, must pay for increased costs, but to go with inflation, but they can never go down if the value goes down. I think that's a recipe for not good taxpayers' outcomes.
Thanks for that observation. Senator Driscollowski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just an observation, members, this is kind of where the rubber hits the road with when the state continues to buy 10,000 acres of land every single year in our legacy bill and our LCCMR bill. And, the counties are in a position where they can't derive the tax revenue they need in order to make the roads work. And we continue to use taxpayer money to buy private lands and put it into government and make it non-taxable for those areas. So Senator Green and myself and others have been talking about this, members, a lot for years in both bodies. And this is where the rubber hits the road. And Senator Nelson raised the issue about why are we doing this in statute? And obviously it came forward by legislators last year because of the frustration of local units of government, what they're facing. The rubber's hitting the road. We're smelling the smell of burning rubber in legislative policy, and people need to take note. We might need to take a different direction and stop just willy-nilly every single year buying all of this land. It's making the problem even worse. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your report this morning. We appreciate it and your service.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Before we adjourn for the day, as we know and we have announced next week, the 3 hearings, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Senator Weber is going to be chairing the committee. Senator Weber, do you have a brief overview of the bills we're going to be hearing bills, and of the 262 bills that were introduced today, 57 of them, a big number of them, Senator Weber's, on sales tax exemptions, but over 50 of them are coming directly to the tax committee. Senator Weber, any preview for the members?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. What I would just like to mention is that we are attempting to make sure that we have revenue estimates on all these bills. Some have been recently requested. There could be modifications, obviously, to this agenda depending upon the availability of the necessary information. Right now, we're looking at, on Tuesday, going through Senator Rest's Turk modifications, Senator Drazkowski's property tax refund and household income definition, A couple of Senator Rest bills regarding firearm safety and food service. I have a couple regarding in-home child care tax credit and property tax exemption for leased conservation land. Wednesday, Senator Klein has a limitation on assessments and Senator Nelson's medical device sales tax exemption. And then we're also Weber bill for ag homestead credit expansion, and Senator Rest's 4D and resident trust definitions. And on Thursday, we're going through the list. So we'll get them determined today.
Oh, I
the
see.
final bills,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Trying to give the department, dealing with bills for which a revenue estimate is easier to calculate than some of the more complicated bills. And the committee will be meeting at 8:30 on each of those 3 days. Any questions about the schedule? All right, then, there being no further business before the committee, we're adjourned.